Copper might not be the most glamorous metal. Everyone knows gold is the most valuable metal, or do they? For thousands of years, empires rose and fell because of gold. Wars were fought over it. Currencies were anchored to it. Entire systems of wealth were built around its shine and its permanence. But right now, quietly and without any dramatic headlines, something fundamental is shifting beneath the surface of the global economy. The institutions that actually move markets and shape the future are no longer looking at gold the same way they once did. There is a group of metals that modern civilization quite literally cannot function without. And most investors, most advisors, and most everyday people have barely given them a second thought. The question is no longer whether gold holds value. The real question is whether it remains the most strategically important metal in the world we're actually building today. And the answer may force you to rethink everything you believe about wealth, value, and the next decade of the global economy. Welcome back to The Unseen Economy. Here we take the most complex financial and economic realities and give them the calm, thorough, and unflinching examination they deserve. If you're new here or have been watching for some time, treat the subscribe button like putting on your seatbelt before a long drive. You can skip it, but why take the risk when the road ahead is changing so fast? Hit subscribe now. It costs nothing and positions you ahead of what is coming. And while you're there, drop a comment below. Tell me exactly where in the world you are watching from today. Your city, your country, or even just your continent. Because this conversation about real value in the 21st century concerns every corner of the planet, from boardrooms in New York to factories in Shenzhen to trading desks in London. Let us begin with a statement that still surprises most people. Gold might not be the most valuable metal anymore. That single sentence is enough to trigger strong reactions in almost anyone who hears it. For millennia, gold has not simply been a metal. It has been a symbol of permanence. It has been a universal language of wealth spoken by every civilization, regardless of culture, geography, or era. Most people never question its supremacy. They inherit the assumption the same way they inherit family traditions or long-held beliefs. Their parents trusted gold. Financial advisors still recommend it as the ultimate safe haven. Central banks continue to accumulate it in record quantities. Popular culture glorifies it in movies, books, and stories of lost treasure. And so the belief persists, almost by default. Gold is the ultimate store of value. End of discussion. But here is what the most serious economic observers have begun to recognize with growing clarity. The world that crowned gold as king no longer exists in its pure form. The world that is replacing it runs on electricity, advanced technology, renewable energy infrastructure, digital systems, and interconnected supply chains that depend on an entirely different set of materials. To understand why this shift matters so deeply, one must first understand how gold earned its legendary status in the first place. Gold did not become the standard by accident or clever marketing. It rose to dominance through a rare combination of physical and practical qualities that were exceptionally difficult to find together in any single material during most of human history. It does not corrode. It does not tarnish. It does not degrade even after centuries buried in the earth or lost at sea. A gold artifact recovered after 2,000 years can look nearly identical to the day it was created. That kind of durability made it ideal for storing value across generations in an era when most other materials decayed, rotted, or fell apart under the pressures of time and the elements. It was also rare enough to maintain real exclusivity, yet not so rare that it could not circulate widely as money in trade. Gold occupied that perfect middle ground. It struck the ideal balance between scarcity and usability. Additionally, it possessed a natural visual and tactile appeal that spoke directly to human psychology. It shines with a warm, unmistakable luster. It carries substantial weight in the hand. It feels solid and real in a way few other substances ever have. In a pre-digital world without electronic records, without paper instruments, and without complex financial systems, human beings needed something they could see, touch, and trust with their own eyes. Gold delivered that experience better than anything else on Earth. This combination of qualities led civilizations to adopt it instinctively. Empires then formalized it into law. Governments eventually built entire monetary systems around it. The gold standard was more than just financial policy. It was a declaration that gold served as the ultimate anchor of economic reality itself. Even after most nations moved away from the formal gold standard during the 20th century, the psychological and institutional trust did not vanish. It simply shifted form. Gold became the asset that investors and nations turned to whenever confidence in paper currencies began to falter. When inflation accelerated, gold rose. When geopolitical risks spiked, gold rose. When banking systems showed signs of strain, gold rose. It earned its reputation as the ultimate safe haven. It became the financial insurance policy that required no counterparty signature. The data supports this enduring trust in ways that cannot be easily dismissed. Global gold demand has repeatedly pushed past 5,000 tons in recent years. Central banks, especially those in emerging markets, have added hundreds of tons to their reserves even as prices climb to historic levels. These are not emotional or sentimental purchases driven by nostalgia. They are deliberate, calculated decisions made by some of the most sophisticated institutions operating in an environment of elevated global debt, competing currencies, and persistent geopolitical uncertainty. Gold carries no counterparty risk. No government can simply print more of it into existence. No single policy decision can dilute its supply overnight. No corporate bankruptcy can make it disappear. These are genuinely powerful attributes. Any honest analysis of this debate must fully acknowledge them before moving forward. Yet this is precisely where the conversation becomes genuinely important, and where the conventional narrative begins to show its limits. Everything just described explains why gold dominated the past. It explains why gold built its towering reputation over centuries. It explains why gold still commands deep institutional credibility and respect today. But it does not explain what the global economy of the next 30 to 50 years will actually require to function and to grow. It does not address the materials the energy transition now depends upon at massive scale. It does not speak to the metals that modern technology, defense systems, advanced manufacturing, and critical infrastructure now classify as strategically essential. And that widening gap between gold's historical prestige and the functional demands of the modern economy is exactly where the real insight begins to emerge. Consider a simple but revealing thought experiment that forces the issue into clear focus. If every gold mine on the planet suddenly stopped producing tomorrow, the world would experience genuine financial shock. Markets would react sharply, portfolios would suffer meaningful losses, investors would scramble for alternatives. But daily life would continue largely uninterrupted. Phones would still function, hospitals would keep operating, power grids would continue to run, transportation systems would keep moving people and goods, civilization itself would not collapse. Now reverse the question and examine the opposite scenario. What if copper disappeared tomorrow? The result would not be mere market volatility or temporary panic. It would be immediate, structural, and potentially irreversible systemic collapse. Every electrical wire on Earth contains copper. Every motor, every transformer, every circuit board, and every device that powers modern life depends on it. Communication networks would fail within hours. Manufacturing lines would halt. Hospitals would lose critical power. The infrastructure supporting 7 billion people would grind to a sudden and terrifying halt. There is no ready substitute available at the global scale required. There is no quick workaround waiting in the wings. That single contrast forces a deeper and more uncomfortable question than most wealth conversations are prepared to ask. If the disappearance of one metal merely disrupts financial markets, while the disappearance of another would disable the very foundations of civilization, which metal is truly more valuable in the era we actually inhabit? This is not a comfortable line of inquiry for those whose entire framework of wealth and security is built exclusively around gold. But it is the question that supply chain strategists, energy analysts, geopolitical thinkers, and forward-looking institutions are confronting with increasing seriousness and urgency. The modern economy does not run on historical reputation alone. It runs on function. It runs on materials that enable the technologies and systems we now take for granted. And when one begins to examine the metals that actually form the physical backbone of the 21st century, the picture that emerges challenges long-held assumptions in profound ways. Begin with silver. Most people still view silver as simply gold's less expensive sibling, a secondary monetary metal for those who cannot afford the real thing. That perspective belongs firmly in the past. Silver has become one of the most industrially indispensable metals on Earth today. Every high-efficiency solar panel requires significant amounts of silver to conduct electricity effectively, not as decoration, not as a minor component, but as a core functional material that makes the entire panel work. The photovoltaic cells that convert sunlight into usable power rely on silver paste. Now, there is currently no commercially viable replacement at the scale the world now demands. And the solar industry is not slowing down. It is accelerating at a pace that is beginning to alarm serious supply analysts. Governments across every major economy have committed to renewable energy transitions. Those commitments require solar infrastructure at a scale humanity has never attempted before. The silver those panels will consume does not fully exist in projected mine supply. That gap between demand and supply is not some distant future problem. It is a pressure that is already building quietly beneath the surface of commodity markets. Then there is platinum, rarer than gold in the Earth's crust, far more difficult and expensive to extract. Concentrated in a remarkably small number of geographic locations, this creates a supply vulnerability that makes economists and strategists nervous when they study it carefully. Platinum sits at the center of hydrogen fuel cell technology. Many serious energy analysts consider hydrogen the most promising long-term solution for decarbonizing heavy industry. It also holds potential for shipping and aviation. These are sectors that solar and battery technology alone cannot easily reach. If hydrogen becomes what many institutions now project it will become, platinum's strategic importance will not just grow. It will become a matter of national energy security for the world's largest economies. Copper's story deserves even deeper attention. The electrification of the global economy is not a trend. It is a structural transformation already underway. It means the shift from fossil fuel systems to electric vehicles, electric grids, and electric infrastructure at every level. This transformation requires copper at a volume that current mining operations are simply not positioned to deliver. A single electric vehicle contains roughly 2 to 3 times more copper than a conventional combustion engine vehicle. The charging infrastructure those vehicles require adds another massive layer of copper demand. Grid modernization, which is necessary to handle the increased electrical load of an electrified economy, adds yet another layer on top. Analysts who study this carefully are not describing a mild supply tightness. They are describing a structural copper deficit that will define economic and geopolitical strategy for decades to come. The mining industry operates on development timelines of 10 to 15 years from discovery to full production. It cannot simply turn a dial and increase output to match the surge in demand. The copper that the electrified economy of 2035 will require is dependent on mines that need to begin serious development right now. Many of those mines have not yet been approved. They have not been financed. Some have not even been fully discovered. Lithium completes this picture with an additional layer of geopolitical complexity. Lithium is the metal that sits inside every rechargeable battery powering the digital and electric world. Laptops, smartphones, electric vehicles, and grid storage systems all depend on it. Lithium is not optional in any of these applications. It is foundational. The nations that control lithium reserves have begun to understand that they are not simply sitting on a commodity. They are sitting on leverage that can shape entire industries. The pattern across all of these metals tells the same consistent story. The modern economy has quietly built itself on a foundation of materials that most investors, most financial advisors, and most wealth conversations have historically ignored in favor of gold's familiar reputation. And that foundation is now under enormous pressure from multiple directions at once. There is a subtle game being played inside every major economic debate about value. Most people never notice it. They walk into the conversation. They listen to both sides. They pick the argument that sounds most convincing. Then they walk away believing they have reached a solid conclusion. But what they have actually done is accepted someone else's definition of the question without ever examining whether that definition was fair, complete, or honest in the first place. The debate over which metal is most precious is perhaps the cleanest example of this game that exists anywhere in modern economic conversation. Because the word precious does not have one fixed meaning. It never did. And the moment one side starts winning the argument under one definition, the other side quietly shifts the definition, introduces a new scoreboard, and declares a different winner. This has been happening for decades in commodity analysis, investment media, and financial commentary. And almost nobody stops to call it out directly. So let us call it out directly right now. When gold advocates say precious, they mean historically trusted, universally recognized, and institutionally held as a reserve of value across centuries of monetary stress. Under that definition, gold wins convincingly. The evidence is overwhelming. The track record is real. No serious analyst disputes it. But when silver advocates say precious, they are no longer talking about monetary history. They have quietly shifted the scoreboard to industrial indispensability. They mean deeply embedded in the technologies that the modern economy cannot function without. Under that definition, silver presents a genuinely strong case, and gold suddenly looks less dominant. Then platinum enters the conversation. And the scoreboard shifts again. Now precious means geological rarity combined with irreplaceable industrial application. Platinum is rarer than gold in the Earth's crust. It is harder to mine. It is more geographically concentrated. And it sits at the center of technologies that the global energy transition depends on. Under that definition, platinum challenges both gold and silver simultaneously. Then someone introduces copper and lithium. And the entire framework changes once more. Now precious means civilizationally foundational. Copper carries electricity through human infrastructure. Lithium powers the batteries that store and deliver that electricity. Remove either one, and the conversation about which metal is most valuable becomes irrelevant, because the people having that conversation no longer have the civilization to conduct it in. And then the most modern version of this argument arrives. Strategic importance. Which metals do the world's most powerful governments, militaries, and technology sectors consider so critical that they are willing to build foreign policy around securing them? Under that definition, rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, and copper enter the picture in ways that gold simply cannot match. Gold does not appear on most critical minerals lists published by defense departments and energy ministries, but copper does, lithium does, Cobalt does. Rare earths do. 5 different scoreboards, 5 different winners. The same word precious stretched across all of them as though it carries a single consistent meaning. This is not an accident. It is the inevitable result of a debate that has never been disciplined enough to agree on its own terms before beginning. And the consequence of that undisciplined debate is that millions of people make financial and economic decisions based on conclusions that were never actually proven. They were simply declared by whoever was speaking most confidently at the time. The honest economic thinker must therefore do something uncomfortable. They must resist the instinct to pick a winner before defining the contest. They must sit with the complexity long enough to understand that different definitions of value produce genuinely different answers, and that those different answers are not equally relevant to every situation, every investor, every nation, or every era. A retiree preserving decades of accumulated wealth operates on a different definition of precious than a government securing the raw materials its defense industry requires. A solar energy developer operates on a different definition than a jewelry manufacturer. A central bank operates on a different definition than a semiconductor company. And a 21st century economy powered by electrification and data operates on a fundamentally different definition than an 18th century empire funded by colonial gold extraction. Context does not just influence the answer. Context determines the answer entirely. This is why the most dangerous economic mistake a serious thinker can make right now is to assume that the definition of precious that dominated the last 2 centuries will automatically dominate the next 2. History does not work that way. Economic dominance does not work that way. The metals that matter most in any given era are the metals that the productive and strategic demands of that era cannot function without. The previous era needed gold to anchor its monetary system and to provide a trusted store of value across generations of uncertainty. The current era and the one now forming need something else entirely. And the next era is already making its demands known quietly, structurally, and with an urgency that the most serious institutions on Earth are no longer able to ignore. The only question that remains is whether the people making wealth decisions today are listening closely enough to hear it. There's a clear difference between money that reacts and money that anticipates. Most people operate with reactive money. They watch prices move, they read headlines, they hear confident voices on financial media, then they adjust their positions after the shift has already happened. By the time the average investor understands why a metal's value has changed, the institutions that understood it first have already positioned themselves, already profited, and already moved on to the next structural opportunity. Anticipatory money operates on an entirely different timeline. It does not wait for headlines. It reads supply chain data before supply chains break. It studies government policy documents before those policies become market events. It maps geological concentration before scarcity becomes a crisis. And right now, the most sophisticated pools of anticipatory capital on Earth are doing something that should capture the attention of every serious economic thinker watching this conversation. They are quietly, systematically, and deliberately repositioning away from a purely gold-centric view of precious metals. They are not abandoning gold. That distinction matters enormously and must not be misread. Gold remains a legitimate, institutionally respected store of value. Its role in serious portfolios is not disappearing, but the exclusive focus on gold as the only metal worth serious strategic attention is being replaced by something far more nuanced, far more data-driven, and far more aligned with where the global economy is actually heading. The reason for this shift is not sentiment. It is not trend following. It is not financial fashion. It is geology meeting policy, meeting technology, in a collision that produces one unavoidable conclusion. The materials that the next global economic era requires are not the same materials that the last global economic era required. And the gap between what the world needs and what the ground can currently supply is widening at a pace that makes strategic positioning not just attractive, but necessary. Begin with the energy transition, because that is where the structural demand shock is most visible and most quantifiable. The world's largest economies have made binding commitments to reduce carbon emissions on timelines that require an extraordinary acceleration of renewable energy infrastructure. Solar farms, wind installations, electric vehicle networks, battery storage systems, and modernized electrical grids are not optional components of this transition. They are the transition itself. And every single one of these technologies is built on a foundation of specific metals whose supply chains were never designed to meet this level of demand simultaneously. Copper sits at the center of this story in a way that is difficult to overstate. Independent research institutions and the International Energy Agency have published projections showing that the copper demand generated by energy transition infrastructure alone could exceed total current global copper production within this decade. That is not a marginal supply tightness. That is a structural deficit of historic proportions. And the mining industry, which operates on development timelines of 10 to 15 years from discovery to production, cannot simply turn a dial and increase output to match. The copper that the electrified economy of 2035 will require is dependent on mines that need to begin serious development now. Many of those mines have not yet been approved, financed, or even fully discovered. Lithium tells a similar story with an additional geopolitical dimension. The concentration of lithium reserves in a small number of countries, combined with the concentration of lithium processing capacity in even fewer countries, has created a supply chain vulnerability that defense ministries and energy security analysts are now treating as a first-order strategic problem. Nations that cannot secure reliable lithium supply chains cannot build the battery technology their electric vehicle industries require. Nations that cannot build that technology fall behind in one of the defining industrial competitions of the 21st century. This is why governments are not simply monitoring lithium markets. They are intervening in them. They are signing bilateral supply agreements. They are funding domestic processing capacity. And in some cases, they are reclassifying lithium as a critical national security material. Cobalt, which sits inside the lithium-ion batteries that power electric vehicles and consumer electronics, carries its own concentration risk. A significant portion of global cobalt production comes from a single country operating under conditions of persistent political instability. That dependence has already produced supply disruptions that rippled through technology supply chains at the highest levels. The largest technology companies and electric vehicle manufacturers on Earth are now spending billions of dollars attempting to redesign their battery chemistry, specifically to reduce cobalt dependence. That level of investment is not a response to a minor inconvenience. It is a response to a recognized strategic vulnerability. Rare earth elements complete this picture in the most geopolitically charged way of all. These 17 metallic elements with names most people cannot pronounce and applications most people never think about sit inside every advanced military system, every electric motor, every wind turbine generator, and every sophisticated electronic device produced today. Their concentration in the supply chains of a single dominant nation has already become one of the most sensitive pressure points in global trade and diplomatic relations. When rare earth export restrictions were threatened in recent years, it did not produce polite concern in boardrooms. It produced emergency strategic reviews at the highest levels of multiple governments simultaneously. And through all of this, gold watched from its traditional position, stable, trusted, institutionally held, performing its historical role with the quiet dignity of an asset that has earned its reputation across millennia. But the serious capital, the capital that is not simply preserving wealth but actively positioning for the structural demands of the next economic era, is no longer looking at gold alone when it asks the question of which metals deserve the deepest strategic attention. It is looking at copper and asking how civilization electrifies without it. It is looking at lithium and asking which nations control the batteries that control the energy future. It is looking at rare earths and asking which supply chains are one diplomatic crisis away from catastrophic disruption. It is looking at platinum and asking what happens to the hydrogen economy if access to this extraordinarily rare metal becomes contested. These are not the questions of speculators chasing short-term price movements. These are the questions of sovereign wealth funds, defense procurement agencies, multinational energy companies, and the most rigorous, independent economic research institutions on Earth. They are the questions being asked by exactly the kind of anticipatory money that has historically been on the right side of major structural economic transitions before those transitions became obvious to everyone else. The conclusion that emerges from all of this is not that gold has failed. Gold has not failed. Gold has done precisely what gold has always done, and it will likely continue doing it for the foreseeable future. The conclusion is something more precise and more important than that. In an era defined by electrification, decarbonization, digital infrastructure, and geopolitical competition over the raw materials that make all of those things possible, the most valuable metal is not necessarily the one with the longest historical reputation. It is the one that the world's most powerful economies have quietly decided they cannot afford to be without. And that answer, studied carefully and honestly, does not always point to gold. It points to whatever sits at the irreplaceable center of the economy the world is actively building right now. The investors, the institutions, and the nations that understand this earliest will not simply preserve wealth through the transition ahead, they will define it. The ground beneath traditional assumptions about value is already moving. The only question that matters now is whether you are positioned to move with it.